Hey everybody. All right, week 3. We are pretty well into the semester. We're going to have our first lab this week. Your test is coming up next week. So we're kind of in it now. Hopefully you have got a feel for how everything is laid out in this class. If you still feel like you're kind of struggling and you're not getting in a rhythm of where to find things, number one, just the basic stuff, like make sure you're checking Blackboard. Make a list, like these checklist announcements right here. Make sure that you're paying attention to those and you're making a list of what you've got to do and when the due dates are. But if you're doing all that and you're still having trouble with anything, feel free to reach out to me. Find my contact information in the instructor info. If it's during office hours, call my office number and I'll be glad to help. If not, just shoot me an email or shoot me a Blackboard message. All right, so this week, the first thing and most important thing probably we've got this week, they're all important, but still, you've got a practice exam. I assigned that to you last week. That was just to make sure you know how to use Respondus. But remember, the other big thing is I want to make sure you know how to follow the instructions before you take the test. Things like clearing off your environment, making sure there's no phones or notes or books or anything like that. So even though this was a practice exam, I want you to follow all those rules because that's what you're going to have to do to get credit for the real test, all right? So that practice exam is due Wednesday. That'll give me time to watch everybody's videos and grade them and send you some feedback like on Thursday and Friday next week. So if you haven't done that, I need you to do that like as soon as possible. That way also, like if you run into any issues with Respondus, we can sort it out before the due date this Wednesday, all right? So that's the big one before we start anything else. We had our first lecture last week was on first part was intro to animals, and then we talked about sponges and ctenophores and cnidarians. So this week we're going to move on to some other simpler animals. Most of these are going to be worms, so we're going to be looking at flatworms, roundworms, rotifers, which aren't worms, but they're another really simple organism, and annelids, which are things like earthworms, and the worms we're probably a little more familiar with. So you've got that lecture to watch, and at the end of the week, Sunday, September 12th, you have a review quiz on that lecture, all right? So just set aside some time to do that. I think it's like a 2.5-ish hour lecture. So what I did was I split it into smaller sections. That way, if you got an hour, you can watch like parts 1 and 2, and then you can watch parts 3 and 4 later whenever you get another chance. So make sure you do that. Okay, another thing I assigned you earlier, and a lot of you have done, but this is Friday the 3rd is when I'm recording this, and I just checked, and there's a lot of people that haven't done this yet. So you have to, number one, order your lab kit. I think this is like the 10th time I've had to, I know you're getting tired of me saying that, but you have to have a lab kit. So if you have not ordered it, honestly, it's probably too late before the first exam at this point. But we're going to have 10 labs this semester, and if you don't do those, you're shooting yourself in the foot. It's over 20% of your final grade comes from labs. So you have to, number one, got to buy your lab kit. But number two, you need to sign up for SI Cloud, which is our lab website. So again, just go over to the lab tab to the left, click on the video up top, and it explains how to do all that. And then there's a link for our lab website over in the lab tab too, all right? So you got to make sure you've signed up for SI Cloud. And then not only that, there are a couple prerequisite activities you need to do. These are really short. One of them is just making sure you know how to use the website. The other one is on lab safety, just making sure you realize what you need to do in certain situations. Our labs are really safe. We're going to be dissecting, so you are going to have like a sharp scalpel and things like that. So we need to know what to do if an accident happens. But it's not bad, but it's something that you have to do before we can do the real labs. All right? So our real lab this week is called Classification of Species. And this is something, honestly, hopefully you remember from Biology 103. If you remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. If you remember all those different categories, that's talking about classification of species. We're also going to use like how we identify certain organisms. You're going to look at something called a field guide and a dichotomous key. And you're going to build your own to kind of figure out the difference between different species. All right, so this should be a little bit of a refresher from some of the stuff we talked about in Biology 103. The reason we're doing it in this class, though, is that we're talking a lot about different categories and classifications with different species. So this is a good just kind of refresher lab to do at the beginning of the semester before we get into any of the dissections. Just a heads up, I know the last part of this lab you have to build your own dichotomous key, and that's kind of tricky, so I'm going to be pretty lenient when I'm grading those. But what you need to keep in mind, the dichotomous key is something that if I start with step 1 and I go all the way through step 2, step 3, step 4, if I follow all those steps, I should be able to identify any type of tree is what we're going to be doing. You're going to be building a key. I know that's way too much information. You haven't even looked at the lab yet, so when you read the instructions, that'll make more sense. But that's the big mistake I see people make on lab 1 is you just like make a list, and it's not like a thing where you start with step 1 and you should be able to find any type of tree. All right, so keep that in mind when you're doing it. And then just a reminder, again, you have to have the lab kit. You have to have done the prerequisites before you can do the lab. All right, finally, just a reminder for next week. Your first exam is going to be on next Monday and Tuesday, so September 13th and 14th. It's just going to be on these first 2 lectures that we've watched. So the Intro to Animals, Sponges and Cnidarians, and the one we're doing this week. All right, flatworms, roundworms, rotifers, annelids. So that's coming up pretty soon. If you have not started studying already, I would go over to the Learning Materials tab, and at the bottom of the Unit 1 folder, you're going to find a study guide. This is not a list of test questions. It's just an outline of these are the topics we talked about. These are the things you might want to look at when you're preparing for the test. But if I'm studying, I'm using the PowerPoints. I'm using all my notes, and I'm using all of that material to study. Don't think like just the study guide by itself is enough. It's there to help you, but you also need to look at all the other stuff we covered in class and the lectures. All right? So that's it for this week. If you got any questions, let me know, and I will see you later.